For more than 16 years, one name has stood for a single unforgettable moment. A pilot who turned catastrophe into a landing so controlled that the world simply called it a miracle. He never asked for the fame that followed. Yet he spent the years afterward using it to fight for safer aircraft, better trained crews, and passengers who could trust the people flying them home. Now, at 75, that same composed man is asking the public for something new. Not celebration. Not another round of tributes. Just understanding. In the past week, Captain Chesley Sullenberger shared news that has quietly reshaped how his story will be remembered, and reminded the world that real courage often shows up when no cameras are rolling at all. Chesley Burnett Sullenberger III was born on January 23, 1951, in Denison, Texas, a small city near the Oklahoma border. His family traced its roots back generations to Swiss-German immigrants, and the household he grew up in valued quiet discipline over noise or attention-seeking. He had one younger sister, Mary, and the two were raised in a home where achievement mattered more than applause, a philosophy that would define almost everything Sullenberger did for the rest of his life. As a boy, he built model aircraft and watched military jets thunder overhead from a nearby Air Force base, a sight that planted the seed of his lifelong fascination with flight. Academically, he was exceptional, consistently ranking near the top of his class and testing well enough by age 11 to qualify for Mensa. In high school, he led the Latin club, played first-chair flute, and graduated near the top of a class of roughly 350 students. But it was outside the classroom where his future really took shape. He earned his glider license at 14 and was flying a small propeller plane by 16, years before most of his classmates had a driver's license. That early passion carried him directly into the United States Air Force Academy, where he entered with the class of 1973. He was selected for a competitive glider program almost immediately, and by the end of his first year, he was already serving as an instructor for fellow cadets, an unusual honor for someone so young. When he graduated, Sullenberger received the Outstanding Cadet in Airmanship Award as the top flyer in his class, foreshadowing a career that would be defined by precision under pressure. The Air Force sent him to Purdue University, where he earned a master's degree in industrial and organizational psychology, a field that would later shape his lifelong interest in how people think, communicate, and make decisions during moments of crisis. He trained on military jets before moving into the F-4 Phantom II, flying with fighter squadrons stationed in England and Nevada, eventually rising to the rank of captain. During those years, he also served on aircraft accident investigation boards, quietly absorbing the kind of technical expertise that would define the rest of his career. By 1980, he had left active military service and entered the airline industry, eventually settling with U.S. Airways and its predecessor carriers, where he would spend the next 3 decades logging tens of thousands of flight hours. Alongside his regular flying duties, he worked as a flight instructor, an accident investigator for the National Transportation Safety Board, and a safety chairman for the Airline Pilots Association, helping build protocols that airlines still rely on today. His work on crew coordination and error prevention eventually influenced federal aviation guidance, and he played a key role in developing a crew resource management course that he personally taught to hundreds of fellow pilots. None of the passengers who boarded his flights over those years had any idea that the calm, unremarkable voice welcoming them aboard belonged to a man who had spent his entire adult life studying exactly what goes wrong in a cockpit, and exactly what a well-trained crew must do to bring people home safely when it does. On January 15, 2009, Sullenberger was in command of U.S. Airways Flight 1549, an Airbus A320 climbing out of LaGuardia Airport in New York, bound for Charlotte, North Carolina. Barely 2 minutes after takeoff, the aircraft struck a flock of Canada geese. Both engines lost power almost instantly, leaving Sullenberger and First Officer Jeffrey Skiles gliding a powerless commercial jet over one of the most densely populated stretches of land on Earth. Air traffic controllers offered him a return to LaGuardia or a diversion to nearby Teterboro Airport. Sullenberger judged, correctly and almost instantly, that neither runway was reachable in time. Instead, he made the decision to ditch the plane in the Hudson River. What followed became one of the most studied emergency landings in aviation history. Sullenberger later admitted that the sudden silence of both engines failing was one of the most shocking sounds he had ever heard, and that the seconds before touchdown brought the worst sinking feeling of his flying career. And yet the landing itself was smooth enough that the aircraft stayed largely intact on the water, giving all 155 passengers and crew members time to evacuate onto the wings and into the rescue boats that arrived within minutes. Before leaving the aircraft himself, Sullenberger walked the aisle twice to make sure the cabin was completely empty. He was the last person off the sinking plane. Investigators later concluded that ditching in the river was the right call. Standard emergency procedures for engine failure are built around cruising altitude, not the first minute after takeoff, and any attempt to turn back toward a runway would have risked a crash over a crowded neighborhood. New York's mayor at the time nicknamed him Captain Cool for his composure, though Sullenberger has since said that calm exterior masked real fear, and that he struggled for weeks afterward with sleeplessness and flashbacks resembling post-traumatic stress. Even a hero, it turned out, carried the weight of what almost happened. The tributes came quickly and from every direction. President George W. Bush called him personally. President-elect Barack Obama invited the entire crew to his inauguration just days later. Both chambers of Congress passed resolutions honoring Sullenberger, Skiles, the cabin crew, and the first responders who pulled passengers from the icy water. New York City handed him a key to the city. Time magazine ranked him second on its list of the year's most influential people. Weeks after the landing, he and the crew received a standing ovation during the Super Bowl pre-game ceremony, proof of just how far their story had traveled beyond aviation circles. The rescue itself relied on far more than one pilot's steady hands. Nearby ferry operators and tugboat crews reached the sinking aircraft within minutes, pulling passengers from the wings and the frigid river before hypothermia could set in, an effort investigators later credited as essential to the fact that not a single life was lost that day. The aircraft itself was eventually recovered and now sits on permanent display at what is today known as the Sullenberger Aviation Museum in Charlotte, renamed in his honor. For a man described by friends as naturally shy and private, that sudden wave of global attention was almost as disorienting as the landing itself. Rather than fading from public life once the headlines cooled, Sullenberger spent the following decade building a genuine second career around education and advocacy. He continued flying commercially until 2010, retiring after 30 years with the airline with a final flight from Fort Lauderdale to Charlotte alongside Skiles and several of the original Flight 1549 passengers. That same year, France awarded him the rank of officer in its Legion of Honor, and he served as Grand Marshal of the Tournament of Roses Parade, a clear sign of his transition from working airline pilot to public figure. In 2009, he partnered with journalist Jeffrey Zaslow to write a best-selling memoir that went far beyond the Hudson landing, opening up about his father's death by suicide in 1995 and the private grief that followed, a disclosure that later turned Sullenberger into an outspoken advocate for suicide prevention awareness. That memoir became the basis for a 2016 film directed by Clint Eastwood and starring Tom Hanks, which introduced an entirely new generation to a story many assumed they already knew. He followed it with a second book in 2012 focused on leadership under pressure, cementing his reputation as a voice on courage rather than simply a pilot who got lucky once. Between 2009 and 2013, Sullenberger and Skiles served together as co-chairs of a youth aviation education program, using free introductory flights and outreach to inspire the next generation of pilots and encourage countless young people to consider careers in aviation. Their work earned them a prestigious award recognizing not just their actions on Flight 1549, but their lasting impact on the future of flight. His expertise also became highly sought after in the media. In 2011, CBS News appointed him as an aviation and safety analyst, a role in which he explained complex aviation incidents and safety procedures to millions of viewers whenever a major aviation story broke. Rather than simply narrating headlines, colleagues say he approached each appearance the way he once approached a pre-flight checklist, methodically, without exaggeration, and always with an eye toward what viewers could actually learn from a tragedy rather than just how it looked on camera. That same year, he addressed world leaders and policymakers at the World Economic Forum in Davos, sharing lessons on crisis leadership and high-performance safety systems that reached far beyond the aviation industry, influencing conversations in medicine, engineering, and corporate risk management. His continued contributions were recognized with multiple industry honors through the following decade, celebrating both his technical achievements and his public communication. The 2016 film built around his story did more than dramatize a single afternoon on the Hudson. It reintroduced Sullenberger to a generation of viewers who had only a vague memory of the actual event, and it also reopened public interest in the investigation that followed the landing, including the tense hearings in which safety officials initially questioned whether he could have made it back to a runway instead of ditching in the river. Sullenberger has said in interviews that he pushed for the film to portray those hearings honestly, insisting that audiences understand the landing wasn't just an act of instinct, but the product of decades of training, muscle memory, and split-second calculation. That insistence on accuracy over easy heroism became something of a signature for him in the years that followed. Whether he was consulting on documentaries, addressing engineering students, or briefing airline executives on cockpit culture, Sullenberger also became one of aviation's most consistent watchdogs. He publicly criticized Boeing and federal regulators after two fatal crashes involving the 737 MAX, testifying before Congress that the disaster should never have happened and pointing to what he described as a broken relationship between manufacturers and the regulators meant to hold them accountable. He continued raising similar concerns in the years that followed, whenever he felt safety standards were being loosened. In 2021, President Biden nominated him to serve as the United States ambassador to the International Civil Aviation Organization, a role confirmed by the Senate that placed the former airline captain at the center of global conversations about flight safety. He presented his credentials in Montreal in early 2022 and served through that summer, capping a remarkable transformation from a quiet regional pilot into one of the most trusted names in international aviation policy. Away from the podium, his private life stayed remarkably steady. He married fitness instructor Lori Henry in 1989, and the couple settled in Danville, California, where they adopted two daughters, Kate and Kelly, and built an ordinary family routine that stood in sharp contrast to his public reputation. Friends have long said that contrast is central to who he really is. A man capable of extraordinary composure in a crisis who nonetheless spent most evenings focused on homework, dinner, and the small rituals of raising two kids in the suburbs. In mid-July 2026, Sullenberger shared news that reframed how the public understands this chapter of his life. In a personal statement posted to his own website, he revealed that he had recently been diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's disease. He described the diagnosis in plain, direct language, explaining that for now it means a name doesn't always come easily to him, that he sometimes repeats a story he has already told, and that his sleep isn't what it used to be. He was careful to frame himself as being at the very beginning of what he called a long journey, choosing the same understated tone he once used to describe the technical details of a water landing rather than dressing the moment up for effect. Sullenberger said he has been working closely with Dr. Gil Rabinavasai at UCSF Medical Center in San Francisco, and that his doctor helped him understand just how widespread Alzheimer's really is, a disease, he said, that spares no age group and touches millions of families around the world. He described it as an unwanted visitor at the door and explained that after talking it through with his family, he decided to share the news publicly rather than face it privately. He said he hoped his openness might spare other families some of the isolation that so often comes with an Alzheimer's diagnosis, and that he now considers himself part of a much larger community moving forward together. It's a message that echoes something Sullenberger has said for years about the aftermath of Flight 1549, that courage, once shown, tends to be contagious. Now, he's applying that same idea to a very different kind of emergency, one that unfolds slowly, privately, and without a single dramatic moment to define it. Those close to the Sullenberger family, say his wife Lori and daughters Kate and Kelly, have rallied around him in the weeks since the diagnosis became public. Lori has described her husband as the same steady presence he has always been, both before and after the Hudson landing, and now again facing this new challenge. She has said that steadiness continues to guide the family as they adjust to what lies ahead, and that although the future is uncertain, they intend to keep living fully and finding joy in ordinary, everyday moments. Medical experts note that there is currently no cure for Alzheimer's disease, and that symptoms typically progress over time even when they begin mildly. At the same time, Improved detection tools and newer treatment options have given many recently diagnosed patients more paths forward than were available even a decade ago. Dr. Rabinavasai and his colleagues at UCSF have been at the forefront of research into earlier diagnosis methods, and Sullenberger's decision to name his physician publicly reflects the same trust and expertise that guided him through decades of safety work in the cockpit. Longtime colleagues have pointed out that this is far from the first time Sullenberger has chosen honesty over comfort. He was similarly candid years earlier about struggling with symptoms resembling post-traumatic stress after the Hudson landing, and about the grief that followed his father's suicide. Two disclosures that, at the time, helped normalize conversations many public figures still tend to avoid. Coverage of his latest announcement has repeatedly noted that he described his symptoms in his own words and his own voice, using the same measured tone that once helped calm an entire cabin of frightened passengers 30,000 feet above the Hudson River. Alzheimer's disease affects millions of families across the country, and public figures who speak openly about an early diagnosis often help push the condition out of the shadows and into everyday conversation. Sullenberger's statement made clear that he does not see this diagnosis as a reason to withdraw from public life, but rather as a new chapter in which the same discipline that once defined his flying career can now support his family and community through what he openly called a long and uncertain road ahead. The response from the aviation community has been immediate and heartfelt. Fellow pilots, safety officials, and former colleagues from his years with U.S. Airways have offered public messages of support, many of them describing the same sense of steadiness they remembered from working alongside him decades earlier. Former First Officer Jeffrey Skiles, who shared the cockpit with him on Flight 1549 and has remained close to him ever since, is among those who have spoken about the news, describing his old colleague as someone who has always faced hard truths directly rather than looking for an easier version of events. Aviation safety organizations, several of which Sullenberger has worked with for years on pilot training standards, have also acknowledged the diagnosis, with some noting that his willingness to discuss it publicly may help ease the stigma still surrounding cognitive illness within a profession that prizes sharp reflexes and constant vigilance. Members of the public who were aboard Flight 1549 that day have weighed in as well, many describing a mixture of gratitude and sadness at the news. For some of the 155 passengers who survived the landing, Sullenberger has remained a distant but meaningful presence in their lives in the years since, a person whose split-second decisions gave them decades they might not otherwise have had. Several have said they hope to reach out to him personally now that his diagnosis is public, viewing it as a chance to return, in some small way, the sense of being looked after that he gave them on the river that afternoon. For a man whose entire public identity was built around a single afternoon of extraordinary calm, this latest disclosure feels less like an ending and more like a continuation of the same instinct that guided him on January 15, 2009. He is choosing, once again, to walk toward a difficult moment in full view rather than away from it, trusting that his honesty will help others facing the same diagnosis feel a little less alone. Reports following his announcement have emphasized that despite the diagnosis, Sullenberger remains committed to his lifelong mission of service, describing this new chapter as another test of the same steady character that once safely delivered 155 people back to solid ground. Friends say that instinct has never really changed, whether he was gliding a powerless aircraft toward the surface of the Hudson River, testifying before Congress about airline safety standards, or simply telling the public the plain truth about a difficult diagnosis. Sullenberger